Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't know how excited I am to introduce you all to Reverend Dr. William Barber.
Hello, Wisconsin. You can sit down. I'm good. It's good to be here, and we're going to cue the video up at the end because I try to follow the lead of the Spirit, and I was listening to, where's that young man? Some things he was saying, and so I want to put a face. You can actually take that down. Yeah, you can. I want to put a face on some of what he was saying just a moment ago. It is my honor and privilege to be here with you at the Summit on Poverty and Swim Conference. I want to thank you for the work of the Social Development Commission of Milwaukee and Marquette University. Thank you, Abra and Amy and Michael, the president of Marquette, and all of you who have had so much to do with my being here. Where'd my sister go? There she is. She's been so kind and so gracious. I want to raise a scripture today. It's found in the 10th chapter of the book of Hebrews. And it was written in a time when movement people were about to quit. When people who had been instructed by their leader that their work was to care for the poor, the brokenhearted, the blind, the bruised, the captive, and all those who had been made to feel unaccepted. In fact, their leader, this brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, born in the ghettos of Nazareth, had said that was the work of the Spirit. And just before he was crucified by the system for being a revolutionary and for leading with the poor, not just on their behalf, he gave some further instructions. He said to nations, and you know, when you talk to nations certain ways, nations will kill you. And he said to the nation of his day, every nation will be judged by these questions. When I was hungry. He didn't say individuals. He didn't talk about it as personal one-on-one. He talked about it systemically. He said every nation will be judged not by how you give people a turkey on Thanksgiving and Christmas, or simply by how you have a few churches that hand out things. They ought to do that, but that's not what he said. He said nations will be judged by these questions. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick and without health care, did you care for me? And when I was an immigrant, did you welcome me in? And he said that in a time where there was this power structure led by this guy who loved to put his names on buildings. And this guy that loved to put his names on buildings, he came from a long line. It wasn't like he was the beginning of the injustice. He came from a long line, and they all took on the same name, Caesar. So it wasn't that he alone was the problem. He represented the system. He was the iconography of the problem. You know, he loved to steal. He loved to lie. He would put his name on the money too. And he oppressed anybody who stood against him. And he was powerful. He had a certain level of power because it wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And by the time we get to Hebrews, people are standing and he's gone crazy. In fact, he's killing people, militarizing the community, doing crazy stuff with other countries. And the people who have been told to stand for the poor and stand for the sick, they have gotten tired. And some of them are thinking about quitting. And it's to them that one of the apostles writes, listen, we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. That's what was seen to this coalition, said to this coalition of people, clergy, poor people, impacted people, and advocates nearly 2,000 years ago in the time of Caesar. Now, I raise this today because properly defining oneself and one's nature and one's calling is a critical philosophical and theological discipline. Knowing who you are is critical. It has penetrating and practical implications, especially when you find yourself in a nation in crisis or a season of challenge, or you're confronting threats which seek to take your identity or redefine you. Knowing who you are, as that young man said, knowing why you do what you do is critical to your sanity and your ability to sustain a fight back against the forces of oppression. The truth of the matter is, Paul Tillich once said, you better know who you are when you face the very threat of non-being and non-existence. Dr. King one time diagnosed America as having a neurotic sickness and septic commitment to racism, poverty, and militarism that was destroying its soul and ripping apart its moral promises and moral possibilities. I like to translate that by saying, America has deep schizophrenic tendencies. We say one thing in our creeds and often do another thing in our deeds. Every politician places their hand on a Bible or a Quran or a book of faith and swears to uphold the Constitution. And one of the key things they swear to uphold is to establish justice. And after all of that lofty commitment, oftentimes we see people use their power to establish injustice. That's what you call political schizophrenia. And you cannot help a nation that has deep tendencies to schizophrenia if you don't know who you are yourself. That's why Martin said a long time ago, and Fannie Lou Hamer and Jewish brothers and women welfare rights sisters, we have to raise a campaign with poor people and moral leaders, with those who have nothing to lose. And they are the only ones that might have the moral and spiritual capacity to turn the nation's conscience and character toward the way of truth, love, and justice and nonviolence. I come here today as president of Repairers of the Breach and the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and my co-chair Liz Theo Harris, and many, many others. I hope you all have that video at the end. 43 coordinating committees now in 43 states, 120 partners, 15 religious and faith denominations and groups. We've been working at this over 3 years. We developed, first thing we did was develop something called the Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the War on Poverty and the Poor People's Campaign. I hope all of you get it, go on the Poor People's Campaign and download it. It was done for everybody because I come from a tradition that you try to make sure you're not loud and wrong. So we had economists, sociologists, historians in the same room with impacted people to do a serious audit of America. Where are we really? State by state and as a nation. And then on Mother's Day of 2018, we launched the beginning of the Poor People's Campaign for 6 weeks of action. Many folk here in this state and others, 6 weeks of nonviolent actions at state capitals, recognizing that in America, you have to build from the bottom up, not from the top down if you really want change. And over 50,000 people participated, over 5,000 people were arrested, over 38 million people reshared the tweets and reshared our information, and on June 23rd, 30-some thousand plus people gathered in DC to say we are now the new, we are the founding members of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. We're waking up to the realities. We won't be silent anymore. We're black, we're white, we're brown, we're red, we're yellow, we're young, we're old, we're gay, we're straight, we're Jewish, we're Christian, we're Muslims, we're Sikhs, we're Unitarians, we're people not of faith but who believe in the deep moral principles of the Constitution. We're from every region of this country. And then after that, we went to more than 97 cities and counties on a bus tour with the media embedded to put a face on the numbers, put a face on the numbers, put a face on the numbers and the realities. And we identified 5 interlocking injustices that you must address simultaneously if you're going to address poverty. And you don't even start with poverty. You have to start with systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism like that kind promoted by Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. and others. And you have to address all of those together. They can't be separated out. We have to come out of our silos, not leave our silos alone, because your silo is important. But there are times when in this nation, we have to find our way together. And just so you know, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is not an organization. We're not trying to compete with it. We got enough organizations. We need a mobilization. We need a movement where all of us can find ourselves together. We need a place where people aren't worried about their turf, worried about their ego, but understand unless there's a mighty move of consciousness in this country, everything you and I want to see happen will not happen. It never has, and it never will. There's nowhere in American history you can look at where there was transformative public policy shift without a moral movement somewhere in the midst of that. And so now, I come here today, I took a detour from the More tour. We're calling it the We Must Do More. Say that. We must do more. And MORE stands for mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote. Listen at the name now. We must do more. Mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote. We began in El Paso, Texas, by invitation, in the place where 23 people were shot down by white nationalism and the policies and the words of white nationalism and the policies of white nationalism before the gun was ever used. And our Latino brother said, come here because we don't want America to just talk about white nationalism and racism when somebody gets shot or when somebody uses the N-word. We understand white nationalism as being policy and words that often lead to the works and the war and the violence of white nationalism. We will end in Memphis, Tennessee, and the Delta of Mississippi in May of 2020. And then on June 20th, 2020, we are calling for a mass Poor People's Assembly and moral march on Washington, D.C., where all of us will come together, all over this country, by the thousands. And on that day, on that stage, the voices will not be people speaking on behalf of poor and impacted people, but poor and impacted people of every race, creed, and color speaking on behalf of themselves. Give me a little bit more on this mic. Telling their stories, but also lifting up a vision right after the primaries, when we know who's running, and before the conventions. And basically saying to the convention, you really don't have to send some celebrity to get us to vote. If we hear our policies, if we hear that you're addressing systemic racism and systemic poverty and ecological devastation and the war economy, we'll know who to vote for. But we need to register people not just for the election, but for the movement who vote. That's a different way of saying it. Because a lot of times people will go into certain communities and register them to vote and won't come back no more anytime, anywhere. And so we're going all over this country because we believe what the scripture says. Thank you for helping me a little bit on this mic. My voice is tired. We believe what it says. We are not of those who shrink back and quit, but we are those who must press on. This movement, and we're in a moment where we must be focused not just on criticizing the Republican Party or pushing the Democratic Party, but saving the soul of this nation. We have to not only have our summits in hotels, we got to get our feet in the street and our bodies in the street and in legislative halls. We must do this. We cannot be silent anymore on systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and the ravages of the war economy and this distorted moral, religious, nationalist narrative. We can't do it anymore. We have to go after the consciousness of this nation. Now, why? And why must we do it together? Did you know that in 2010, touch your neighbor and say, long before Trump? That's one of the greatest problems I see right now. And too many people are acting like Trump is the cause of all of this. See, I'm country, so I'm going to tell y'all something. You can apply it any way you want to. Every now and then down in the country, we get colds. And when we sneeze, I don't know what happens in Wisconsin, stuff comes out. But the stuff that come out ain't the problem. It's the symptom. And if you're going to treat the problem, you got to go deeper inside. Because the stuff that come out your nose, that's just a symptom. You wipe that. But if you wipe that off in one election, but you don't address the deeper issues, you're going to get a cold again. In fact, it might turn to pneumonia. And some of what we're seeing now is pneumonia. Because in truth, America has never dealt with the realities fully of the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and this false moral narrative. And Trump is what Neil Painter at Princeton says, he is merely the symptom. She says he's the iconography of a too often repeated American reality. We take a few steps forward, and then we take a massive backlash of steps in reverse. Did you know, so let's talk about way before Trump. Did you know in 2010, 23 states passed racist voter suppression laws? 23. Did you know that represents 54% of all of the members in Congress? Do you know that in the 13 former slave states, from Virginia to Texas, that's only 13 states, but those 13 states control over 170 electoral votes. And all of those states are voter suppression states. So if you can control the 13 former Confederate states, you only need 99 electoral votes from the other 37 states to win the presidency. You can control you can control 26 U.S. senators from the 13 southern states, which means you only need 25 from the other 37. You can control 31% of the total members of the United States House of Representatives from 13 states. And if you add Wisconsin, because Milwaukee used to be called the Selma of the North, if you add the voter suppression of Wisconsin and places like that, long before Trump ever ran for office, voter suppression was crumbling our democracy, long before Russia. In fact, I think one of the greatest mistakes in this whole conversation right now is we've talked a whole lot about Russia and very little about voter suppression. Racist voter suppression. I believe that the most racist politician we have in America right now is not Trump. It's McConnell. And he doesn't sound like a racist. But when you look at the number of judges he's appointed, when you look at how he and Boehner and Ryan blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 2,000 days, Strom Thurmond blocked the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for one day, and we call him a racist. Because racism is not about intrapersonal stuff alone. Did somebody call you the N-word? Racism is about policy. Now, you said, well, Reverend Barber, what does that have to do with the issue of poverty? Every state that's a voter suppression state is a high poverty state. Every state that is a voter suppression state is a deny health care state. Every state that is a voter suppression state is a block living wages state. Every state that is a voter suppression state passes policies against women. Every state that's a voter suppression state passes policies against Latino and people of color immigrants. Every state that is a voter suppression state passes anti-LGBTQ policies. So, for instance, you can't be for gay rights and not stand against voter suppression. And watch this. Now, here's the talk, my brother. Here's the conversation we're going to have if we want to deal with that stuff you're talking about. Every state that is a voter suppression state, like Wisconsin, the people who benefit from the voter suppression are mostly white or are white. In some places, even some black politicians benefit from voter suppression because they cut deals and say, stack all the black folk in my district so I'll never have to really run. That's a conversation for another day. I mean, I don't play. You can't play with this stuff. Racism ain't just coming from white folk. A black snake can bite you just like a white one, and sometimes worse. See, that's why racism, that's why you can't just, racism, you got to get down to policies. I don't care if you black, but you support voter suppression. We have a couple of black senators in the United States Senate. One of them from South Carolina, Tim Scott, supports voter suppression. It doesn't matter that he's black. He is enabling racism. But let me get back to what I was talking about. So the people who benefit from voter suppression are mostly white. And when they get elected, they pass policies that hurt mostly poor white folk. Y'all didn't get that. You didn't get that. See, we've got to move past the racialization of poverty and really understand poverty. In fact, we got to stop just saying poverty and say poverty and low wealth. That's what our audit did. It's not just poverty, it's poverty and low wealth, right? And we have to, if we're going to have a conversation, if we're going to get black and white people to join together, we got to understand what Dr. King said in '65 at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, and that is that every time black and white people have the potential to build political coalitions that could transform the nation, the racist aristocracy sows division and fools people with what he called the psychological bird of Jim Crow for their hungry stomachs, rather than helping them to understand. And so the majority, that's the irony. The very people that use racist voter suppression to get elected, once they get elected, they hurt mostly white people in raw numbers. In raw numbers, they hurt mostly white people. And if you begin to have, I was in Kentucky, East Kentucky, where they voted 89% for Trump. And some folk told us, don't go up there. I said, why? You don't know them people. I said, yeah, I do. They're people. And we took the Poor People's Campaign to Harlan County. Now, what most folk don't know that don't study history, Harlan County was where Lyndon Baines Johnson initiated the the war on poverty, up there in eastern Kentucky. So we went to East Kentucky on a Tuesday, Wednesday. 500 folks showed up, almost all white. And some folk came from Louisville. So we had black folk from Louisville, white folk in the same room. And we have these maps, I wish I had them today, that we put up. And when we talk about poverty and we go in a room, we don't talk about poverty first. We put the map up of systemic racism as seen through the lens of voter suppression. We have 5 ways we look at voter suppression in this movement. Racism, voter suppression, resegregation of schools, incarceration, attacks on people of color, immigrants, and attack on our Native American brothers. So those are the 5 penetration areas. But we use voter suppression as that serious penetration. We put the map up with voter suppression on it. And then we overlay that map with all the states that have the highest poverty and the highest child poverty. We don't even talk about black or white, highest child poverty, highest women in poverty. Then we do highest black poverty, highest Latino. Then all the states that have denied health care, all the states that are against the LGBT community, so forth and so on. And by the time you get to the end of it, the maps are overlaid, look the same states, right? And I was in one place, and this white guy stood up and said, Reverend, can I say something? I said, what? He said, damn! I said, I'm glad you said that. He said, they've been playing us all the while. He said, man, I'm joining this movement. He said, I'm joining this movement. I had another one there. He said, Reverend Barber, he said, I asked him, I said, why did y'all vote for Trump? He said, well, we knew he wasn't S-word. We knew he wasn't. He said, but he came back here. And a lot of folk have abandoned us, right? If you can get people to come together when you show them the truth of the oppression, that racism is not just against black folk, it is against democracy and humanity. Racism hurts all of us. Now, after that, did you know that there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country? Not 40 million. All of the groups dealing with poverty, we need to stop using that government number. We need to use the number out of Columbia University that talks about all the people in poverty and low wealth, and the people that are in poverty and would be even deeper if it wasn't for the supplements. 140 million. That, my friends, is 43% of this nation. Did you hear what I said? 43% of this nation. It's not some problem on the margins. 43% of this nation are poor and low wealth. 39 million of all our children. 61% of black people. 61% of black people are poor and low wealth. 61. A little over 30% of white people are poor and low wealth. But here's how you have to further disaggregate that number. 61% of black people is around 26 million, 20-something million black people. 30-some% of white people is 66 million white people. So in terms of impact on the community, percentage-wise, poverty hurts people of color and black people more. But in terms of raw numbers, over 40 million. Over 40 million. And women, white women, and children, and the disabled make up the greatest number. But there was an effort in this country to racialize poverty in order to undermine our willingness to deal with it by those who wanted to rob the government through tax cuts. So they racialize poverty. So when most people talk about poverty, they talk about it as a marginal issue. And we have to have a movement that says no longer will 143 million people be silent. No democracy can exist when 43% of your population exists in poverty and low wealth. Did you know that 250,000 people die every year from poverty? Now think about that. When a racist cop shoots an unarmed African-American man, we get in the streets, and we should. But 600 people die every day from poverty, and the policies of poverty that create poverty. 600 people a day of every race, creed, and color die from heart attacks, strokes, and diabetes, and cancer. Die from, what did he call it? The violence of systemic poverty. That's why Coretta Scott King years ago, when someone asked her, they said, what do you feel about violence since your husband was shot through the neck and his spine was severed and he died instantly? She said, well, that was violence. She said, but I look at violence much deeper than that. She said, poverty is violence. Blocking people's education is violence. Denying people the right to vote is violence. Denying people labor rights is violence. Denying living wages is violence. Disrespecting people's culture is violence. And then she said, an apathetic attitude that refuses to address these other violences is also a form of violence. We have to have a movement that starts asking the question in America, are you on the side of policy violence? Or are you going to be for the nonviolent realities of establishing justice? Did you know that many people are one $400 emergency away from poverty, while 3 people own as much wealth as the bottom half of America? Did you know that 60 million people go to work every day for less than a living wage? They have to live in their cars. I never will forget, I went into a homeless camp, and there was a white woman there who had had a major medical issue. And she went from middle class to poor to homeless. And there was a black guy there living in the homeless camp. In fact, it was very diverse. It was black, Latino, children, white. He worked every day, but he came home to the camp. They swept the ground to keep it clean. They were in the woods right down the path from a church that had on its sign, gay people going to hell. That church was more worried about putting gay people in hell than it was about a homeless camp living less than 200 yards down in the woods. And when I was there, I cried uncontrollably, and the lady told their stories, and then she said, as I was getting to leave, she said, don't forget us. She said, we probably won't be here because the police will come and run us out. They don't like us. They like to hide us. She said, don't forget us. Somebody working every day of their life for less than a living wage. Congress makes $15 a minute. And this country has locked people up who wanted $15 an hour in a union. Did you know there's not one state in this county or country where someone that earns the federal minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment? Not one county, no county in this country. Did you know there are 8 to 11 million homeless people are on the brink of homeless, and we've got millions of empty houses everywhere, and the largest number of young people that are homeless are gay, LGBTQ young people? Did you know even with the Affordable Care Act, everybody's Affordable Care, that's great. It's not Obamacare, by the way. It's Affordable Care. We don't call Social Security Roosevelt Security. See, that was a trick we should have never walked into. Huh? Right. It was a racist trick. You name it like that. We don't call Medicare a Johnson Care. Right? 30 million, but even with the Affordable Care Act, 30 million people don't have health care. We're the only of the wealthiest countries, 25 wealthiest countries in this world that do not offer some form of health care to all of its people. And if we had a single-payer healthcare system, it could save $310 billion a year. That's why Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate economist, when we met with him, he said the fundamental question for America is not how much will it cost to fix poverty, how much does it cost, how much is poverty costing us as a nation? We talk about Flint, but there are 14 million families who can't afford water. We talk about Flint, but there are 4 million families that get up every morning. They can go down the street and buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. Huh? Did you know that SNAP or food stamp serves 1/4 of poor families, and 4 out of 5 SNAP recipients are children? And when a nation has a group of politicians that would starve children, you don't have a left problem or a right problem or a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. You have a moral crisis on your hands. Did you know if we pull the amount of money that so-called undocumented immigrants put in the Social Security system that they never get, the Social Security system would implode? And one of the reasons we can't deal with this issue of our Latino brothers and sisters and other people of color from other countries, but let me talk for a minute about our Latino brothers and sisters, is because every debate refuses to address the ultimate lie. Texas, New Mexico, and California didn't belong to us. In fact, none of it did. But I just want to tell that in the 1800s, we started a false war to take Texas and take New Mexico and California because the Texans wanted to keep their slaves and the other folk wanted the oil and the gold. So how in the world do we keep calling people illegal who are simply coming back to the place that was theirs in the first place? And until America faces that, do you know Native Americans are still living on reservations considered wards of the state and can't even own their own homes? And that we are allowing multinational companies to go on that land and drill for things like copper and poison the aquifers? That some reservations at the gate of the reservation has signs up, hazardous material. Did you know that spending on federal prisons has increased 10 times since 1976? And if you ever get a chance, I'm almost through, there's a book you ought to read called God, The Incarcerated God. And in that book, there's an interview with somebody in a particular state, and the question is asked, why are you okay with putting more money in prisons than you are in schools? And the person said, oh, that's easy. We can't live like we want to live unless we remove some people from society. So we first moved and put them in ghettos, but the ghettos fill up. And then we've got to have somewhere else to put them. Did you know right now in this country, 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar goes to the military? And only 15 cents goes to infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Think about that now. We've got 800 military bases around the world. We could cut our military budget by $350 billion, and we would still have more money in our military than China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran combined. And most of the money is not going to the soldiers because the average combat soldier barely makes a living wage, if they make a living wage. The average combat soldier makes about $35,000 a year. The average military contractor makes $19 million a year. But I know somebody here saying, but Reverend Barber, that's not Wisconsin because, you know, we got it going on. Well, in Wisconsin, there are 2.3 million poor and low-income persons. Notice I'm changing your numbers. 2.3 million poor and low wealth. 51% of all the children in Wisconsin are poor. That's no marginal issue. 41% of all the women, that's no marginal issue, 1.2 million people. 65% of people of color in Wisconsin are poor and low wealth. That's 704,000 people. 34% of white people are poor and low wealth in Wisconsin. That's 1.5 million. There's 700,000 more poor and low wealth white people in Wisconsin than there are African Americans. The top 1% in Wisconsin, their income grew by 149% from 1979 to 2012, while the income for the bottom 99% only increased 1% over the same years. In Wisconsin, there are 415,000 people who are uninsured. And all your politicians up here that say they love the military, well, there are 109 veterans who make less than $35,000 a year in Wisconsin. 24%, almost 25% of the census tracts in Wisconsin are tracts at risk for being unable to afford water. And 26,000 metric tons of nitrooxygen are emitted yearly in Wisconsin, and it is the leading cause of respiratory problems, and most of that stuff is being emitted close to poor and low-wealth community. There are 5,000 people who are homeless in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, you have to work the state minimum wage. You have to work 89 hours a week to afford a basic two-bedroom apartment. And there are 1.2 million workers that make under $15 an hour. 44% of your workforce makes less than a living wage. And that's why I say to my brothers and sisters in the cloth, it's a shame and a disgrace for a preacher to stand up and ask people to give something to their pastor's anniversary, and you won't get in the street and fight for your folk to have a living wage. I don't care how much you run and shout to people, and I don't care how much your praise team and how good it is. When you do that, you are fulfilling what one critic of religion called using it as the opium of the people. The church and the religious community has to be in the middle of the fight against systemic racism and poverty. Otherwise, we are engaging in theological malpractice at best and heresy at worst. But we can't shrink back, y'all. We are not of those who shrink back. Because, first of all, it doesn't have to be this way. If we raise in this country to a $15 federal minimum wage, it would raise pay for 49 million workers. About $328 billion would be pushed into the economy. Raise the GMP. We got to talk about investments, not just giving away. If we repeal the Trump tax cut, because not only did we do an audit called the Souls of Poor Folk, we did a moral budget in our movement. A moral budget. We found the money, because they say there's scarcity. We said, no, it's not. They said, you got to raise taxes. No, you don't. If you just repeal the Trump tax cut, and by the way, that tax cut took more money from the back of working people and gave it to the elite aristocracy or the elite oligarchy than was taken from the backs of slaves and given to the slaveholder. The amount of money that was transferred in the Trump tax was more than the amount of money if you transferred from the backs of the slaves. If we repealed it, Wall Street, we could generate $886 billion per year. If you just had an annual wealth tax on the 75,000 wealthiest household out of the 400-some million people that make up this country, you could generate $275 billion a year. That is enough to put 2.5 million people to work fixing our public infrastructure. And if just one company, if we took one military contract from one country, one company, it could expand Medicaid in all 14 states that did not expand it. Just one contract. So let me be clear. Yes, state houses and governors around the country that have engaged in racist voter suppression have some of the poorest states. Yes, we've got senators and a president who are lying to the people. Yes, the same politicians that support racist voter suppression also support the wall, also block health care, also block living wages, also block addressing the climate, also block equality, equal protection under the law for our LGBT brothers and sisters. And yes, the same politicians would spend more money on militarization in our communities and war. We know what the extremists are doing and will do. But in the face of this, we must declare now what we're going to do. Because 140 million poor people represent more people than voted in the last election. And we're doing a study now that shows that if just 2% of poor and low wealth people would come together in every state, just 2% more, and vote, we could fundamentally shift the political calculus in this country. There comes a time that you can't just keep talking about what your adversary is doing. You got to talk about what you're going to do. Touch your neighbor and say, what you going to do? Yeah, what you going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Let me tell you a few things that happened, and I'm through. Frederick Douglass in 1852, They had a bad Supreme Court. They forced a guy on the Supreme Court named Justice Taney. He shouldn't have never been on, but they pushed him through. He became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And while he was there, he oversaw the passing of the Dred Scott decision. And the Dred Scott decision said that a black man has no right that a white man ever has to honor. And in the midst of that, 2 months later, Frederick Douglass was asked to speak. How do you speak when you've just seen the Supreme Court of the land rule that you don't have any rights? That even if you get to a free state, people can come and take you back. What do you say? Frederick Douglass said, let me tell you something. Frederick Douglass said, I know that the slaveholders are in earnest, and they mean to cling to their slaves as long as they can, and they mean to do it to the bitter end. But I'm glad that there's a Supreme Court above man's Supreme Court. He said, and when I look at this decision, as monstrous as it is, I see another thing. And I see that the very attempt to blot out forever the hopes of an enslaved people may be one necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall and complete overthrow of the whole slave system. For I know through history that the whole history of the anti-slavery movement is studied with proof that all measures devised and executed with a view to ally and diminish the anti-slavery agitation have only served to increase, intensify, and embolden our agitation. Frederick Douglass said, sometimes our adversaries go too far. You hear what I'm saying? Sometimes they're too arrogant, they're too mean, they lie too much, and the very thing they think they're doing to us is just the first preparatory step into the transformation that must come. He says everything that they're doing ought to only serve to embolden and intensify our agitation. This is no time to be bemoaning. This is time to be organizing. Mother Jones, the white labor and women's voter leader, right, in the 1800s, she once told a group, I don't need your organization to be praying no more. You're not a praying institution. She said, it's fighting time now. And she said, this is what you do. When you're in a moment like this, you pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Cesar Chavez said, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. What we need is for folk to begin. And once oppressed people begin and decide to overcome their fear, you cannot stop them anymore. Nelson Mandela was in a jail 27 years, but every day of his life, he got up in that jail, and this is what he said. He didn't say, oh my God, when am I going to ever? He had his days. We all have our day. But there comes a day you got to get over your day and decide what are you going to do, not just what your adversary has done. And so Nelson Mandela decided, this is what I'm going to do. Every day I'm going to get up and I'm going to look at these jail cells, these bars, and I'm going to say, out of the night, covers me black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud under the bludgeoning of chance. My head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horrors of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate, and I am the captain of my soul. Every attack on immigrants, every policy against poor people, every attack on our voting rights should serve only to increase, intensify, and embolden our fight. That's why we need a movement. We don't need any more organization. We need all of our organizations to come together and get in the street and shift the moral conscience of this nation. We don't come from the quitting side. We don't come for the shrinking side. We must do more. Mobilize, organize, register, educate people for the movement who vote. And that's what we must do. We must rise together for voting rights. We must rise together for policies that lift the poor. We must rise together for immigration reform. We must rise together for living wages. We must rise together for housing and health care. As Reverend Barber and Liz and myself, the two of us, we're not trying to be the leaders of all the leaders. We're trying to say, hey, y'all, if they are cynical enough to be together, we ought to be smart enough to come together. We ought to mobilize at the polls. We ought to mobilize at the legislative branch. We ought to mobilize in the street. And we ought to say, look, I may not agree with you on everything, and I may not agree with you on this, but we agree on 80%. That's good enough to stick together. We cannot use some false notion of perfection that often hinders progressives and liberals from coming together. We've got to come together because the soul of this nation is in trouble. We must rise together for free, diverse, high-quality public education and education for all in college. We must rise together to demand that the abundant resources of this country be used in a way that lifts everybody. We must rise together to end mass incarceration. We must rise together to move away from a militaristic society to a society full of mercy and full of grace. We must rise together. And if we rise together, we need to know our truth. You remember I said we must know who we are, because some of us have been repeating the lie of our adversary. First of all, Trump did not win. Touch your neighbor and say, you ought to stop telling that. Trump did not win. He got into office because of the Electoral College. And the Electoral College was designed to do that. It's only happened 4 times in history, and every time it happened, it was bad. Every time it happened, it was bad. So stop saying he won. 3.5 million more people voted against him than voted for him. Now, they say he won Wisconsin. Is that right? Stop telling that lie. He didn't win Wisconsin. Now, the votes, he got 30,000 more votes in Wisconsin, but 250,000 votes were suppressed in Wisconsin, according to Barber, and a whole lot of other folks stayed home. We got to go get them, y'all. He didn't win. 100 million people didn't even vote. A lot of them are the 140 million poor and low wealth people that never hear even the Democrats talk about poverty. We had in 2016, we had 26 presidential debates, not one on poverty. Not one on systemic racism. Not one. Somebody say not one. Democrat, Republican, primary, or general. Anytime your political debates devolve, not evolve, devolve to the place that only you talking about the middle class and the wealthy, you are not going to excite the electorate. We've got to change that. And every time we've needed it, moral movements have reshaped America. Touch your neighbor and say, neighbor, there hasn't been a time in this country when change came by just going to the hotel. Tell them tell them, say change. All over, say change has never come by just sitting in the Wisconsin Center. No, slavery was ended because of a moral movement. Denying women the right to vote, moral movement. Labor rights, moral movement. Social Security, moral movement. Civil rights movement, moral movement. Medicaid, moral movement. Every time this nation has changed, it is when black and white and brown and red and yellow people and gay and straight have found their way to come together and change the moral consciousness of this nation. And since I'm a preacher, I need y'all to understand, I operate from a whole different reality. I can find good news in the graveyard. Because on Friday, I see death, but on Sunday morning, I see resurrection. I know that if God be for me, it doesn't matter if the whole world is against me. I know that if you get the right folk, 1 can chase 1,000 and 2 can put 10,000 to flight. I know we are not of those who shrink unto destruction. It's time to rise up. Rise up. Now, why does Barber keep talking about rising up? Because I want to help you with something. Everybody around here talking about get woke. Well, if you're woke but you ain't out of bed, that ain't worth a nickel. You got to... y'all hear what I'm saying? Y'all hear what I'm saying? Marva Staples wrote a song that was tribute to Nina Simone, and she said, it's not the waking, baby, it's the rising. It's the grounding of a foot uncompromising. It's not the foregoing of the lie. It's not the opening of the eye. It's not the waking, it's the rising. It's not the shade we should be cast in. It's the light and its obstacles that cast it. It's the heat that drives the light. It's the fire that it ignites. It's not the waking, it's the rising. And she said, when we rise, Nina cried power. Billy cried power. Curtis Mayfield cried power. Patty cried power. James Brown cried power. Martin cried power. Malcolm cried power. Fannie Lou Hamer cried power. A white girl named Viola Woosa cried power. The Jewish rabbi cried power. And it's time for poor and low wealth people to rise up and cry power. We've got power to change America. We've got power to turn things around. We've got power to make a difference. If you rise in Wisconsin, and we rise in North Carolina, and we all rise on June 20th, 2020, and we put thousands of people in the street, we can rise with power and change the consciousness of this nation. We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction. It's time to rise and cry power. 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 And let me show you some of the people. The video is back ready, that are crying power, that are finding their way together. If you hadn't seen this, this is what's happening. Don't just believe what you see on CNN and MSNBC and Fox. And I hope we can count on Wisconsin. Don't need to join another organization, but will you help us build this movement that will benefit all of the work that all of us are doing? Bring it up.
Our backs are against the wall, and we got no choice but to push.
You know, before you come down here and cast stones in a glass home, walk a mile in their shoes for a minute.
1 out of 16 people in Aberdeen are homeless. A lot of people are young. That's something that's,
And this in campus?
Yeah.
So they're millennials?
Yeah, between 18 and 35.
Between 18 and 35.
Is probably the largest demographic here.
No health care.
Over there's a memorial cross where my younger brother died this winter.
Here.
He had a heart attack or a stroke due to freaking pneumonia that he couldn't get to the doctor in time. But we kept trying to get him up there, and every time we sent him up there, they sent him back
Yeah.
with no antibiotics. Gave him a couple ibuprofen and said, "Oh, you'll get better." That's how they treat people down here, and he ended up having pneumonia so bad that he coughed so hard it caused a stroke in his head. Another thing to open your eyes to this area down here, when men get out of the service, we're overqualified for jobs. What is overqualified?
What is it? That's right.
It's their polite way of saying they don't want to take the risk to employing you. We were in charge of $1 million machinery, guns, everything, but we can't flip a burger, wash a car, or,
And you want to.
you know,
Right.
just to work.
Just to work.
Get back into society, man.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners
That's right.
have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
My name is Pamela Roach. I'm from Lowndes County, Alabama, and I live in a mobile home with my 2 kids. And I got raw sewage. I don't have no money on power. And I have to travel back and forth to Birmingham to take my daughter with the CPAP machine. Don't have a car and don't have no way to take her.
There's a new chemical company that's producing another carcinogen. And when you think of that, what effect does that have on us as people, especially our children? But in our community, it's amazing the people who just started dying of cancer. That became the big fear. And when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, I was amazed at the black women that would ring our doorbell and walk in the door and pull a wig off to show my wife that I have it too. That red stuff you see there, yeah, that's the chemicals, which is primarily mercury. And they dump tons of it in the river. The school over there, directly across the school ground. And we tried to get the government to test that, the earth, the soil in the playground, and they refused to do it.
Now, I'm also a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide at a far greater rate than the national average. Why? Because they're stressed out. They're stressed out. They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs because they can't pay for all the equipment that it takes to run a farm. And they're in the most dangerous line of work there is, yet many can't afford to buy health insurance. We have no hospital. We are in a food desert. We have one grocery store for the whole county. Our neighbor, my husband's uncle, still drinks pond water self-treated with chlorine. He had to have a kidney removed at age 64. And the year before that, his wife died of some unknown cancer.
We started in a Lem Pomo Indian colony, which when you enter the reservation, before you enter the reservation, it says hazardous area. Enter at your own risk by the county lake of Clear Lake, California. They've been mining mercury since 1957 and have left it open with heavy metal leaking into the water and the land. They stopped fishing in the 1970s and have a high rate of cancer in the community. I worry because I have family, not only just my family there, but the indigenous people in the surrounding communities that are being affected. We talk about health care. We talk about worrying about the environment, but yet when they're allowing open pit mines and letting it leak into the land, into the water, the high rate of cancer and the high bills of health is going to continue to raise because of corporations and greeds and politicians that don't want to listen.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
I'm here today to share my daughter Venus's story. Venus discovered a small lump in her breast, and she wasn't insured. Venus had to be approved for every prescription and every piece of medical equipment that she needed. I'm standing here today in solidarity with the Poor People's Campaign because no one should have to bury their child in America because they don't have health care insurance.
This is not right.
To follow that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved into the street.
Washington Avenue between City Hall and Lark Street closed down.
Protesters with the Poor People's Campaign of Indiana.
2 o'clock on the East closed, 2 o'clock in the middle, 2 o'clock on the West closed. A wave, and the historians tell us it's never happened before.
All of the people you see there are the leaders, the real leaders. Liz and I, co-chair, we're just servants. Our goal is to help build a stage that America not only hear the numbers, but they see those faces. Everybody you see up there is organizing, finding their way together, regardless of their race, their creed, their color, and committed to building a movement to shift the consciousness around these 5 interlocking injustices. I pray and hope that we can count on Wisconsin, because together we can rise and change the moral conscience, because you cannot have new moral policies until you have a new moral imagination. And we are the ones that must do more. God bless you.
Tess? Okay. So what we're going to do is send, because Dr. Barber's schedule is so tight, we don't really have time for questions. So if you could hold your questions that you can? Okay, so he got time. He's only going to take a few. So this is what I'm going to ask. We appreciate your questions, but if you have stood to the mic more than twice already, please relinquish the mic to others for their opportunity to have voice. I'm going to go over here. Chantel, can you go over here? It looks like it's easier for some folks who can to come to me, so I'll know who's next. Okay.
Mine is simple. I'd just like to have the data.
Thank you. Everything that I talked about today, if you go to www.breachrepairers.org or you go to the Poor People's Campaign site, it is on the site, it is downloadable, it is footnoted and triple footnoted, because you know when we deal with these issues, people are going to challenge them. In fact, we had a moral poverty justice Congress in July. Over 1,000 people came, impacted people, religious leaders, advocates. 10 of the presidential candidates came. We invited both sides of the aisle. I want you to know that. And 10 came, and then we presented our budget before the the budget committee of the House, never happened before, when poor and impacted people went into the budget committee, and presented an alternative budget with the numbers are right. And one of the newspapers said, this can't be right. And they fact-checked us and had to admit it was. So the two pieces are called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America, 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign, and then the Moral Poverty Justice Budget. If you go on the website, either breachrepairers.org or Poor People's Campaign, you can pull them down, download them, and we have executive summaries. And we have anecdotal and empirical. So the face and the facts done by some of the best think tanks in this country. And there's a number, what's the number? If you text MORAL, MORAL, if you text that to 90975, you will get constant updates through that text. 90975, text moral, MORAL. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So inspiring. With the recent eviction served to the residents, to the tent city beneath the Marquette interchange, what moral debt are we carrying, and what can we do to pay for that debt now before it comes due?
Yeah. The issue of eviction and running homeless people out and throwing people out is happening far too often. You saw that the part of that video, that was the largest encampment of poor white millennials in the country. It's in Washington State, in Aberdeen, a city of barely 16,000 people with 1,000 homeless folk. And they went through all kinds of legislation, in fact, it's in court now, to basically close the camp down. Because the first great sin of our systemic reality is the attempt to hide folk, as though if we can hide them, they don't exist, right? And so one of our great challenges is to help folk come out of hiding. That's why one of the things we try to do is put a face on everything we do so that folks see it and sometimes see themselves or their child or their cousin. I think in light of the fact that if you look at the number of available housing that's in this country, the millions of homes that are in this country nobody's in, the millions of trailers from hurricanes that are just sitting somewhere empty, and the fact that we allow people to exist or be evicted is one of the great moral scars on this nation. You know, if we really look at it, we put the president in public housing. We put the governor in public housing, right? Our moral foundation is all messed up. We give people, if you get to the United States Senate or the United States Congress, I think you only have to work 6 years to get a full pension and full health care. And the very people that receive that, many of them now will vote against the people that elected them having just the basic of what they have. So I think this country is in for a major moral reckoning. As I said earlier, if you look at a pyramid, you cannot have 43% of that pyramid cracking and think that the other 57% of it is going to be okay. And so we have to sound this alarm, which is one of the reasons, Lance, that there are forces that don't want this kind of movement coalition we're talking about coming together, because we are the alarm system. And when you want to rob something, a good robber first disarms the alarm system. So those that want to rob the government, want to rob America through tax cuts, the first goal had to be to shut down the movements. I mean, let's be real. It got Dr. King killed. It got a lot of other folk killed. When the first thing Donald Rumsfeld and whatnot did when they worked for Nixon was to change all the rules around the community action programs and y'all remember that? How many of y'all old enough to remember all that defunding? That was the same folk that worked for Bush now. Rumsfeld and Cheney, those were the same ones that did all of the defunding. And so we're up against 50 years of stifling, dividing, and trying to break the back of the movement, which is why, as Frederick Douglass says, some things that are very ugly are merely the preparatory signs. In other words, sometimes you have to have an enemy so clear it wakes you up. And I say this to progressives and liberals and whatever folk want to call themselves. I tend not to use those titles. If we can't come together now, if we can't release some of our organizational egos and build a movement together with impacted people, the shame is not on Trump and others. The shame will literally be on us. Yeah. Thank you, my sister. Thank you. Yes.
A lot of nice human beings living at the tent city are my friends. They say to me, please, something for us. They are living there, artists, a lot of veterans, people handling with drug addictions, men and women looking for jobs, not for money, not for food, not for clothes, nothing for material things, looking for jobs. I know. When I go biking around there, they say to me, hi, my friend. Hi, sister. How are you? Good morning. Very respectful in front of the Amtrak station. Please remember to us. Please pray for us. Like Martin Luther King said, we still live in the dream. Kathy asked me, she painted long time ago my son. Where we are going now, Julia? Come on, let's go to the church, I said. Tent City in Milwaukee for homeless, it to mean Hope City. Julia.
And I want that sister to know that there's a couple of organizations for the homeless that have decided to throw down for this June 2020. I want y'all to know this is not just going to be a march. It's a mass poor people's assembly, right? And it's deliberately June 20th, the day before the summer solstice, when the sun is the brightest. We're going to put the brightest light on poverty and low wealth that has been done in years. And I can't talk about some things, the lawyers tell me that are going to happen, but it's not just going to be folk marching, right? It's an assembly. We talk about tent city. See, and one of the things we have to do is learn from the past. You know, there's some studies now that say Dr. King and others were beginning to rethink the strategy about we're going to stay in D.C. until they change, because they began to see it's hard for impacted people to stay that long because the government and the systems can outweigh them. And there was going to be some strategy shifting to build the movement out. We're trying to learn from that, rather than say we're going to stay somewhere 5 weeks and if they don't change, we're going to stay there, because you can't do that, but to build a long-term movement. And so during the course of that week, there are going to be some things that happen. There may be a major tent city in D.C. to dramatize this issue. And we're deliberately doing this. We're doing these 25-state tours. Oh, I forgot to tell you, everywhere we're doing tours, we are embedding the media. We don't just go do a program or speech. We take the media with us to impacted communities, and we're driving it into the consciousness. Because we said the first goal of any movement is you have to shift the narrative and build power. In order to change policies, you've got to shift the narrative, and you've got to build power from the bottom up.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, and I hope that you hear more. We're trying to build a coordinating committee. And again, let me say, our coordinating committees are not trying to compete with organizations. Even in our coordinating committee, we tell them you don't need to meet all the time and do all of that. It is coordinating. Like, you know how you used to coordinate, your clothes? Y'all remember when you used to go to the club and you used to coordinate, right? Your blue blouse didn't get mad with your red blouse, because you didn't wear it that night didn't mean you weren't going to wear it another night. My point is, our coordinating committees are not trying to build other organizations. We're just trying to find linkages, because we don't have to do everything together. But if we can do something massively and transformatively, if you know history, it was the bonus marches in the early 1900s that helped labor, right? It was the silent thing of the NAACP. It was the sit-in. Every place there has been moments. So we need a generationally transforming event that shifts the moral narrative. And there's no need for us to wait till August of 2020 after the political convention, right? What's the point of doing that? We need to do it beforehand and drive these faces and these facts in so deep into the conversation and the consciousness that it forces the political structure to have to address them. Because they don't have the courage to do it unless impacted people, their allies and moral leaders force it. So thank you for that, and I hope we can stay together. Is there another?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Barber.
Yeah.
You have definitely enlightened us today. You're helping us. We thank you so much for being here in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My question, I want to know, as the perspective of a mental health clinician, and there's others of us in a room, what have the people been telling you about how their poverty situations are affecting their mental health? What have you seen?
Well, in that piece on the souls of poor folk, we actually do an analysis of what we call DOTS. Now, some people have post-traumatic stress syndrome, right? Post-traumatic stress syndrome. People who face and deal with the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, and ecological devastation, and the war economy, they have DOTS, daily ongoing traumatic syndrome. Ain't nothing post. They don't even have time for it to be post, because every day is a challenge, right? One of the greatest miracles is the level of sanity that people have in this country who are poor and low wealth. You think about it, the level of sanity that folk have. And so one of the things that people who are impacted say to us all over is they say, they say this country got mental issues. And you think about it. I was thinking the other day, what kind of mental issues do you have when you're a politician? You have about 12 years to deal with this climate before your grandchildren will be negatively impacted about it. But for your own greed in the present, you don't care about your grandchildren in the future. That's a serious psychosis. That's a serious psychosis. So one of the things we're trying to do, and we're getting more people to help us, is to in everything we do, factor in the issue of what this society is doing to people and how it is driving them into DOTS and to mental crisis. I'm as I said, a preacher, theologian, and there's a scripture in the Bible that a lady who is a psychoanalyst, she's a psychologist and a preacher, helped me with one time. She was preaching a revival, and she told the story of the man in the tombs. Anybody know that story about the demonic man in the tombs? And it said that the people chained him to the tombs. And this sister, Reverend Dr. Carrie Bolton, said to us, she said, now sometimes we talk about the man and his problem. But she said, what kind of society chains people to the tombs? What kind of society allows homeless people to stay within eyesight of the Capitol and drive right past it. And then she said, the people said the man had issues. She said, you know, the brother probably didn't have any real issues. He probably was a veteran because he said legions. So he had trauma from the military. She said, but whatever problems he had, after they chained him to the tombs, it exacerbated it. And she said, there comes a time that we must not only talk about where people are, but how we made them go there. But how what have we done to drive people into mental crisis? Which is right. Sometimes we have to change our rhetoric and not merely say such and such a person denied health care. We have to say this person is engaging in policy violence. I mean, we got to amp up some of our language. And I don't mean, I'm talking about like the prophets of the Bible. I don't mean cursing and stuff. I mean really having a sharp edge. You know, like for instance, if for every 500,000 people denied health care, about 2,800 people die. That means, and as a group of clergy, we've decided that if anybody in our church dies from the lack of health care, we're going to ask the family if they will allow us to bring the media in and have an open casket like Mamie Till did for her son Emmett Till. And we're not going to stand up in no pulpit and talk about God took that person home and all. God might welcome them home, but we're not going to keep lying, you know, because that's wrong. If we keep lying, we participate with the system. What we're going to say is this is what government murder looks like.
Come on.
This is what government's saying. Because you know if you block this health care, this is what's going to happen. Right? And that's premeditated. Now, that may sound harsh, but there comes a time in history when you have to call it like it is. You know, one of the abolitionists said, go tell a woman whose child is in a burning house to be calm. But don't tell me to be calm when it comes to slavery and the ravages of slavery. And I think we're in one of those moments where we have to diagnose the mental sickness of society, but also have to talk about how these policies are driving people and what it's doing. And we have to make sure in everything we do, we don't dismiss those realities. We don't, because the reality is all of us are about 5 seconds away from a mental crisis.
Tell the truth.
You ever went looking for your eyeglasses and they won't top your head? Your mental stability is really not that stable. Huh? The right level of things hit you at the same time. So that's why I said when we see people and some of the stuff this nation has done to them and the way we ignore it, and they still can smile and have a sense of sanity, it is a miracle. But that doesn't mean we go around and celebrate their ability to make it through. I hate that when people come into play. And let me tell you some poor people who have just made it through. And, you know, and this is proof that, and I like to tell folk in my last comment, you know, I'm going to confess something to y'all with this cross on. I used to hustle. Pool. Some of y'all went right there. I heard you talking about what? What did he hustle? Was he a pimp? What did he hustle? No, I hustled pool and my name was Big Chocolate. Look at her, she like, Lord have mercy. And you know the way you hustle pool is you create shots that are not supposed to be makeable, right? And you force people to bet on stuff that looks like, because so when we celebrate, you know, these folk came up out of poverty, that just means everybody ought to just pull themselves up by their own bootstrap. First of all, that's a lie. Somebody gave them the bootstrap. But what, But even if they did come up, that doesn't justify the system, because that's like tilting a pool table up on the end like this, and then somebody making the shot uphill, and you say, they made it. But that ain't how you're supposed to play pool. The table's supposed to be level. So it doesn't matter if somebody figures out how to trick shot and make it. That does not justify having an uneven table. And just because some folk made it, when we were at the Senate, when we were in the House, they brought some people to witness against us, and they brought 2 black folk in there to say, we don't need no government program, we made it by ourselves. And then 5 minutes later, they admitted they had used government program. I mean, how come? So we have to challenge the hustle, right? That's why at every gathering we have with the Poor People's Campaign, we have testifiers. And the testifiers are the main focus of the program, not even what I speak about, people who are impacted. And they don't get up there and tell their story and say, but everything is just fine. Somebody asked me, are poor people ashamed to say they're poor? I said, no, they shame of America that keep people in power. Poor folk are all right, with telling their reality. If they know that the telling of their reality is not just going to make people wipe some tissue, but if the telling of their reality is going to cause people to come alongside them, not in front of them, alongside them, and challenge the systems that exist. Yeah, so I don't know why I confessed that to y'all. I feel right at home. I heard somebody say he need prayer now. Can we count on Wisconsin? Are y'all going to check out? Now tell the folk at your table, say June 20th, 2020. We need every church to have a bus, every county to get a bus. Just get a bus, every city get a bus. Come, bring bus, train, let's join together, tell people all over the country, follow us on the text messaging. I think we're coming back to Wisconsin for one of the stops on the tour. I think it's next spring though. And remember, we promise you on that day that the overwhelming majority of the speakers will be impacted people of every race, creed, and color, telling their stories, and then from their stories, laying out a vision, because we're not a movement that just curses the darkness. We're saying it doesn't have to be this way, and we must rise. We woke now. We know what the problems are. We woke, but now it's time to get out of bed and rise up. God bless you all. Thank you so very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Dr. William J. Barber.